Hello everyone and welcome back for the second talk today at this year's TeachSTEP conference. In this session, I'm really pleased to welcome Silvana Richardson, who will be addressing the subject of your knowledge about the language. So Silvana is director at the Bell School, and I'm absolutely delighted to have her with us. And I'll just move her onto the slides. She'll be talking about teaching with confidence as a non-native speaker. So, over to you, Silvana.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Good morning or afternoon or evening. It's a cloudy morning here in Cambridge, and already, as I've spoken my first few words, you may have noticed from my accent that English is not my mother tongue or my home language. Yes, I'm one of those teachers that the title refers to. And I am going to be drawing on my professional history and my experiences and my observations and conversations with colleagues who, like me, are speakers of English as a foreign or additional language. Before we start, let me begin with a bit of a clarification. I'm fully aware that the term non-native speaker has been critiqued, found wanting, critiqued as inadequate for many reasons. I'm not going to elaborate on those, but I do want to mention one that I think is fundamental, because it defines and it calls us as for what we are not. For example, nobody would dream of defining me as a non-man or non-tall or non-atheist or non-child, but yet I'm called a non-native speaker. However, that's why I've used that term in inverted commas. However, I used it in my title because even though there have been other terms that have been put forward as a replacement, if you like, of the term non-native speaker, they're equally unsatisfactory, and let's be honest, is a term that everybody at the time, right now even, seems to understand what it means, and you know, as Holiday says, it still has real currency with the popular discourse of our profession. But during my talk, I will be referring to us non-native speakers of English as speakers of English as an additional language or a home language. Why have I chosen this topic? It is estimated, and this is an estimate from 1999, that 80% of English language teachers speak English as an additional or a foreign language. We are clearly a majority. And if you look at the poll, when I asked you, English is my home language or English is a foreign, second, or additional language, this spread is absolutely the same. We've got 80% of speakers as a foreign, second, or additional language in the audience, and 20% of speakers of English as a home language. For me, the issue is that yet, even though, you know, we're clearly a majority, there seems to be a lack of confidence that's quite endemic, even over 30 years after Peter Mediesh has discussed for the first time the struggle of non-native speaker teachers wishing to be recognized in the ELT profession while at the same time feeling inadequate in their job. So this is the plan for my talk. Firstly, I'm going to discuss this issue of lack of confidence. I think it's important that we understand it better. Then I'm going to explore briefly the contribution that non-native teachers make to the learners and the learning. And then in the third part of my talk, I will look at developing confidence as an English user and give you some tips, you know, that worked for my colleagues and in my experience about how we can develop our confidence as English language teachers and English users. So let's begin at the beginning. Here I'm going to borrow the use of Enric Jurda, who doesn't mince his words about what could be the causes for this lack of confidence historically, if you like. I'll give you 1 second to read this. So basically, he's saying that if as a profession we have traditionally thought of the native speaker as the ideal teacher, this in a way means that the non-native teacher is not the ideal teacher in the thinking of the profession. And a sense that we non-native teachers could never aspire to the same level of authority or even legitimacy of real native speakers. For me, the question is, if you are a speaker of English as a foreign or additional language, and you are a teacher and you've studied English for many, many years, what does this do to your confidence as a teacher? And how does this affect your own practice as a teacher? And if you like, by extension, your students' confidence in you. So what is the impact of this view of a non-native speaker teacher? Eva Bernat talked about what she calls the non-native speaker imposter syndrome. In other words, that a lot of teachers whose first language isn't English feel inauthentic. They feel a bit of a fraud. And this is related to feelings of being inadequate in the role of being a language expert on a language that's not your own language. And there are also concerns and anxiety even that you will be caught out, discovered, that your mistakes will be exposed, etc. And I wanted to illustrate this with two true examples that happened not that long ago. The first one is something that I heard from a teacher who came to do a course here in the UK, a teacher training course, and her trainer was a very gifted Spanish speaker, and this was not me, although I'm Argentinian and a Spanish speaker. And this is what I heard. I didn't come to the UK to be taught by a Spanish speaker, the assumption being that because you come to the UK, you would be taught by an English teacher trainer. And the second one is one that I heard a director of studies say, and this was about a very gifted Italian modern foreign languages teacher who wanted to retrain to become a teacher of English as a foreign language. And she had lived in the United Kingdom for about 25 years and had hints of an Italian accent. And this is what this director of studies said to the trainer who was accepting her on the course. You go ahead and accept her on the course, but don't expect me to give her a job at the end of it. And this really illustrates an example of discrimination, what Rosina Lippi-Green calls discrimination based on accent. And even though we're in a much better place now than we were 30 years ago about this issue, these issues still remain. And this is why I think it is important to become aware of these issues. And I actually chose these two examples to illustrate that prejudice exists not just between native speakers and non-native speakers. The first example is an example of a non-native speaker, being prejudiced against a non-native speaker. So everybody seems to have a bit of a bit of a prejudice. So in my observation and my experience, I have noticed that non-native teachers have kind of coping strategies to deal with this sense of inadequacy or fraudulence, if you like. The typical one that I observed when teachers teach English in countries where English is not the first language is shying away from modeling language. And I was actually remembering something that I was taught when I was at teacher training college that my tutor taught me. And I remember her saying, if you have to model, do not model yourself. At the time we used tape recorders. And she said, play the tape recorder instead, a cassette of somebody who's English or American or whatever. Don't model yourself. And I think in some quarters this still is true. We are shying away from modeling language. And the second example is to shy away from using English in the classroom as the language of instruction and the language of communication. In other words, because of this feeling of inadequacy, we don't feel sometimes that we are a good model or good enough to be able to talk English all the time and not just to do exercises and activities. So the question for me is, how does this impact the learners and their learning? And I'm not going to try and answer that, it's just something to think about. In countries where English is the home language or the first language, what I have noticed is that sometimes teachers whose first language is not English hide the fact that they're speakers of a foreign, a second, or an additional language. I have heard time and time again colleagues of mine saying, I never tell my students that I'm not English. Or the other strategy I've also noticed is that at the beginning they hide the fact that they're not, and I have done this too, put my hand up here, hide the fact that you're not a speaker of English as a home language, and then when the students or the trainees get to know you, get to like you, get to trust you, etc., you may or may not reveal that you're not a native teacher. And this is actually a piece of advice that I was given by a colleague when I started working as a teacher trainer in the UK. And she said to me, only tell them being my trainees, once you know, they know you, and they like you. I think the impact of this is a very high cost for the teacher whose first language isn't English, because what we are thinking here is that our identity, the people we are, is not good enough and has to be hidden. And this is, if you like, a sort of summarizing comment about this issue. That this is Eva Bernat again. And she says that there's still much work to be done by way of empowering the speakers of English as a foreign or additional language, and to encourage them to rethink their own roles in our field, in our profession, and that there is an urgent need to help us overcome the profoundly damaging deficit model. This is what it is, a deficit model of their professional competence. And this is why I think we need to think more and understand what is the important contribution that teachers whose first language is not English make to their learners and their learning. And here I'm drawing on research findings. You will notice that here the comparative is used, and this is because in some of these research studies there were comparisons made between the native teacher and the non-native teacher. But as I briefly develop these, I will get rid of these comparatives. So they talk about, teachers whose first language is not English, of having a higher level of language awareness, higher empathy and a role model function, and a capacity to predict the difficulties that students encounter in the learning process. I will briefly talk about each of these. So in terms of having a high level of language awareness, I'm talking, and I think Jack in the previous talk made a good point, that in many places there are lots of teachers whose English language level is quite low. I'm not talking about these teachers here. I'm talking about qualified professional language teachers. And in general, they tend to have a thorough knowledge of their subject, which is the English language, particularly grammar. And this is as a result of having learned it by a similar route to their students. This is conscious language thought and language learning for many, many years that they've done. And as a result, what happens is that they tend to be clearer in terms of their grammar explanations and in their ability to provide more information about the language. They know about English. High empathy, which comes really from what a colleague of mine calls, I'm one of them, of having walked in their shoes, having an experiential awareness of what it is like to learn English as a foreign language or as an additional language. And as a result, we are quite capable of emphasizing very well with our students' learning difficulties. And when the students and the teacher are based in contexts where English is spoken as a second or foreign language, there is an understanding of what it is like to be homesick and what it is like to experience culture shock, because we've been there and we've done that. An important one for me is that teachers who speak English as an additional language can be very successful and real role models. First of all, because they can demonstrate to the students what it is possible to do, with a second or a foreign language. And here, I'm going to draw my own history and give you some examples of my history. But I'm sure that if you learned English like me, you too can remember remarkable teachers who had inspired you to become the teacher that you now are. I remember being a 9-year-old and attending an English language school in Buenos Aires, where I'm from, and how my classmates and I felt and reacted when our teacher, who was Argentinian and who was a Spanish speaker just as I was, suddenly burst into English, into natural communicative English, because another teacher came into the classroom to borrow a book or to ask a question. It was magic. It was really, really mesmerizing. And I remember also an outstanding inspirational teacher that I was really lucky to have when I was a teenager. Her pronunciation was beautiful. It was a cut above the rest. And I remember wanting to be like her and wanting to sound like her. And she was Argentinian, just like me, and she was a Spanish speaker, just like me. but she worked really, really hard to become brilliant, and that really inspired me. And actually, she was the main reason why I decided to become a teacher of English. And later on, I don't want to go on, but I had wonderful also role models at Teacher Training College. I had the most knowledgeable and professional role models I could ever wish for. All of them Spanish speakers, all of them Argentinian. And if I'm here today, it's because I stood on their shoulders, and I'm very proud of them and thankful for what they have actually given me. So this is the idea that when you have a model that's somebody who learns the language, it also gives you an attainable model, somebody that you can aspire to become. I can't aspire to become a native speaker. I am not. But I can aspire to become a competent, knowledgeable, professional speaker of English as an additional language. And those, were inspiring models for me, and attainable and real models. The other thing is that, and this is not just me saying it, Lee also has written about this, that often teachers who are learners of English are very, very motivated, and that they really do have a very deep love for the English language and a passion and a curiosity for the English language, and it's a serious pursuit for them. The other very, very useful contribution that teachers who are speakers of English as an additional language make is being a bilingual resource. And one thing to remember is that, just as 80% of teachers are, speakers of other languages, the great majority of English learners are at least bilingual. A lot of them are multilingual. Multilingualism in the world is the rule and not the exception. Monolingualism is the exception. So bilingual students tend to benefit from and to respect bilingual teachers. But also equally important is the fact that bilingual teachers are able to integrate and to exploit and to use the student's mother tongue or the home language as a learning resource to help learn English. It is beyond the scope of this webinar to talk more about this, but if you're interested in this area of being a bilingual resource and exploiting positively your students' first language, here are some resources from Cambridge English Teacher and from CUP. I want to recommend Philip Kerr's book, Translation and Own Language Activities, and some resources from articles to tasks by Guy Cook, Rachel Harris's webinar, and Philip Kerr's teaching tasks. The other benefit is this capacity that we have to predict the students' difficulties, and this comes from knowing our own language, our mother tongue. In monolingual context, this is a student's mother tongue as well. Knowing English, because of having learnt it, and having an awareness of the linguistic distance between our mother tongue and English, and having, if you like, an experiential understanding of levelness. I remember at what level I learned, for example, the passive voice. I remember at what level I learned defining relative clauses. I remember being in the room and finding it difficult. So that gives teachers whose language is not English the possibility of predicting which words, which terms, which tenses, etc. are easier or more difficult to understand. And in fact, McNeil has found, he has done a study of Chinese novice teachers and compared with native speaker novice and both more experienced teachers, and he found that the novice Chinese teachers were more able to predict which words and phrases were more difficult to their learners than the other groups. I think it's important also to be balanced, to take a balanced view here. Because yes, absolutely, it is unfair to be perceived as inadequate, as deficient, or as lacking in native speaker proficiency. But it is equally important, as Jack mentioned in his talk before, it is absolutely important to be competent and to be successful users of English to be able to teach English effectively. So what I've said before about the lack of confidence and all that is not an excuse not to be competent users of English. Here's an example for you. I'm going to shut up for a second so that you can read it. This for me is an example where pronunciation is not really, the teacher's pronunciation is not really comprehensible. So clearly this teacher does need further language training. I'm going to pause for 1 second here to give you a bit of time because I've been speaking non-stop for a while. So I want to give you 1 minute to do what you need to do to be prepared for the next part of the talk. Stretch your legs, make a few notes, write down some questions that you might want to ask me later, highlight key points, etc. I'll be back in 1 minute. Okay, so welcome back. So far we have explored the lack of confidence issue, and we have explored the contribution of non-native teachers, between inverted commas, to their learners and their learning. And now I want to share with you some ideas, some tips, some things that have worked in my experience and in the experience of colleagues that are excellent professionals to develop our confidence as English users. And finally, hopefully, there will be time to ask me questions. So, over to the issue of developing confidence. I feel very strongly that confidence comes from knowledge. In my experience, I feel confident when I know that I know. So confidence in terms of language results from knowing that I know the English language, that my knowledge of the English language is sufficiently deep for me to be able to teach it. And this is not just my own little thought. I also found it in the literature. Murdoch has commented on this. A teacher's confidence is most dependent on his or her own degree of language competence. If you know you're competent, then you're likely to feel confident. But also, I think, confidence results from knowing that I know what my students need to learn. Of course, that comes from needs analysis and getting to know the learners, but also from that empathy that I was talking about earlier, of having been there and done that. But also knowing that I know how to help my students learn. But I want to focus more on developing my competence as an English user. I'm sure you already know what I'm going to say. I don't think any of what I'm going to say is new or earth-shattering. I think it's common sense, but I hope it is a useful reminder. And again, I'm going to be drawing on my experience and my colleagues' experience on what works, as well as bits of research. For me, a key ingredient to develop my own competence in English has been exposure, exposure, exposure to a very, very wide range of spoken and written texts, and really to immerse as much as I possibly can in English. To look at different text types, from spontaneous interactive dialogues to podcasts that appeal to your interests, presentations, for example, TED Talks, ads on the telly, the news headlines on the radio, interviews with people whose work you like, I don't know, your favorite authors and singers and actors, campaigners, politicians, etc., YouTube, blog posts, and the list goes on and on and on. Make sure that it is different genres, different registers, different accents. And this is a great moment to develop language competence. It's never been easier to access and use different, sources, or cheaper with technology. For me, the gains from exposure have been that I'm able to listen more, read more, and understand more. And a word here about exposure. Exposure, when you start listening to a text in a spoken text in a foreign language, or even reading, a text that's full of new language, it can be really very difficult. And I think what matters here is perseverance. Sometimes when you're listening, you have to persevere until you tune in and until you become more familiar with that speaker's accent. And that is basically what unlocks the whole thing, really. For me, The other thing about exposure is the importance of making the unfamiliar more familiar. The more I get exposed to a particular accent, for example, the less unfamiliar it becomes. For example, I remember that 15 years ago, I was able to recognize, if you like, some form of standard British English, American English, whatever that means, and Scottish English. And now, because I've been, constantly exposed to English, and I try as much as I can to listen and read in English, that I'm much more able to understand and differentiate and identify, for example, East London accents from Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool and South Wales and Northern Ireland and Dublin and Glasgow. And that is a result of being exposed to a range of accents and understanding and noticing and trying to see what there was there, but more about this in a minute. The other thing for me, which is a gain from exposure, is the acquisition of vocabulary. By this I mean almost effortlessly. I found myself, for example, saying words and phrases that I was not aware that I knew. I didn't remember noticing them. I didn't memorize them. I didn't make an effort to try and learn them. And as I was saying to you, technology, as you know, is great. And there are certain features that can help you. For example, on mobile devices, particularly iPads and the i brands, you can hear spoken audio content at a faster or slower playback rate. So you can slow down the playback rate if you're finding it difficult to cope with the speed of delivery. Also on YouTube, it is possible to switch that. In the speeds, you can choose normal or 0.5 or 1.5, etc., etc. But also, more importantly, what I find is that, for example, on YouTube, you can listen without subtitles, and then if there were some things that you missed and you want to check again, you can listen again with subtitles on, and that's great. It's great aids, really. The second element for me that's fundamental is notice, notice, notice. In other words, what I call becoming a text archaeologist, uncovering, for example, and noticing and registering unfamiliar uses of familiar text. To give you an example, I know the meaning of the word to throw something at somebody. And then I heard that something threw me, meaning it confused me. Well, that was an unfamiliar use of throw. Well, notice that and try to remember that. Notice collocations and idiomatic expressions. For example, that you apologize profusely. That was something fascinating that I found. Colligation, the grammatical company that words keep. So you prefer to plus infinitive, to do something. Noticing that and not just isolated words and their meanings. The interesting thing for me is that all texts can be very, very useful sources, and it doesn't have to be a very extended or academic text. That all texts include little hidden gems. And I want to share with you 3 things that I've learned this week about language from, for example, a sentence made up of 5 words. The other day I was looking at Facebook, and a friend of mine on Facebook posted a photo, and she went, "Lovely day at the beach." Now, I was taught that you have to say on the beach, and I never really had noticed until this week that you can also say at the beach. It was a bit of a revelation for me. So I wondered why I've always heard on the beach, but I've never really until this week heard at the beach. So I did a bit of a Google battle. This is, of course, not very serious linguistic work, but, there's a bit of a difference, apparently, in terms of how people are using on the beach versus at the beach on Google. Something else I've learned, for example, the word space architects. I had no idea that you could use the word space architects. Apparently, they're people who design inflatable homes and farms made of moon dust concrete for Mars. Amazing. So there you go, space architects. This is taken from Twitter, and I've learned it this week. And equally, the third one comes from the BBC News. I knew the word shortlist, but I'd never seen the word long list, which actually happens before a shortlist. There you go, another word that I learned this week from a BBC News headline. So these are examples of noticing and never stopping noticing. Noticing means active and systematic digging. This is not new again. This is, Michael Lewis back in 1993 talking about the observe, hypothesize, experiment paradigm. basically uncovering patterns and trying to make, how does this work? So why is this the way it is? And trying to understand how it works. But then, well, Louis suggests testing your hypothesis by using the vocabulary. But I also say I found it very useful to check with appropriate sources. So here I am making a little hypothesis about what I observe. Well, I go and check with sources, dictionaries, collocation, dictionaries, concordances, etc. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I remember the first time I visited Lancashire in the northwest of England for a couple of days. And I remember being in total shock because the language they spoke was so different from the language I had been taught. And the reason really was that there were so many things that were so different. So once I got over that initial shock, I just thought to myself, hang on a minute, I need to start noticing what is it that they do differently. So the first thing I noticed was about grammar and how they conjugated the past of the verb to be. So everybody was saying with amazing consistency, I were, you was, she were, we was, you were, we was, the exact opposite of what I'd learned. It was an interesting moment for me. The second thing that I noticed was about lexis. For example, I knew, because I had studied this, that for them, dinner was tea, but what I didn't know was what tea was. If I wanted to have a cup of tea, I had no idea what to say until somebody offered me a brew. So I noticed that, I recorded that in my little head, and off I went and ordered brews. And then, finally, for me, the eureka moment of all was pronunciation. I remember, for example, I knew that they wouldn't say bath, but they would say bath, and that they wouldn't say bus, but they would say bus. Yes, but I wasn't quite sure. I mean, I wasn't quite expecting what I found. And what I found is that they were saying things like take, meaning take, and they were saying things like door, meaning door. And the minute I started noticing, I realized that there were some single vowels that were becoming diphthongs and some diphthongs that they were becoming single vowels. And once I kind of felt I cracked it, for me it was much easier to understand and to keep interacting with them. So that's what I mean by active systematic digging, which we can all do. The third aspect for me is the importance of memorizing and practicing memorizing. And I find it fascinating that there's currently, and for the last, I would say, 20, 30 years, a sort of professional dismissal and overlooking of the value of memory, not just in English language teaching, I'll get that there in a minute, but in general education, mainstream education. We hear that remembering is a lower order thinking skill. I'm kind of quoting here Bloom's taxonomy, and saying that remembering is basic, that it is a 20th century skill, that it leads to surface learning and not to deep learning. Rote learning being, kind of also defined as parrot fashion and regurgitation, not very positive language to talk about memorization. And also probably if you like, the hangover of the communicative approach, this idea that, well, not the communicative approach, but what came before the communicative approach. The idea that memorization is a dry and meaningless activity, and that students need to have fun and they need to mingle and interact, etc., etc. Now, the issue is that there is no learning without remembering. And if we talk about memory as a lower order, it means that all the higher order thinking skills like analyzing and reflecting and evaluating and creating are built upon remembering. And actually, Peter Skian says having a good memory is a key component of language aptitude. If you don't have a good memory, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to be fluent in English, for example. Language learning places huge demands on memory. If you think about it, you know this, of course, we depend on our memories to store, to recall, to retrieve words and phrases and collocations and idiomatic expressions and chunks and grammatical forms. And we access all those to be able to interpret spoken and written texts and to speak and to write more effectively. So I think it is fundamental that we kind of revalue and reassess the value of memory and that we practice stretching our memories. And this is Nick Bilbrough saying that a well-trained working memory can help you to develop influency in listening, in speaking, in reading and writing. So there's nothing to lose by stretching your memory. So, just go back to recording new lexes in chunks, to memorize new lexes in chunks. These are things that I was asked to do by my teachers 30-something years ago. To review new lexes frequently, go back to your notes, test yourself, repeat in manageable chunks. All these things that kind of have gone out of fashion. 4, practice deliberately. What do I mean by practicing deliberately? The idea of deliberate practice. I'm quoting here Jeff Petty, but really he draws on the work of Erickson and his study of deliberate practice. This idea that the ability to perform in an exceptionally skillful manner, this is what we want, isn't it, about English, is learned through practicing deliberately. There are no geniuses. Everybody's improvable and to remarkably high levels if you put in the hard work, which is really very hopeful. So, what is deliberate practice? It is different from doing it again or doing more of the same, which leads to very little learning. It is a practice that attempts to improve levels of performance, getting better at English, addressing my weaknesses. It is much more effective when we do it slowly and accurately. Actually, in some studies, experts say that they at least put in 4 hours a day to get, to expert state. It requires full attention throughout, and it's often done intensively. This idea of doing over and over and over again, and effortful, not inherently enjoyable. I remember being a trainee, and this was what my classmates and myself did for hours, both in the then language lab and for homework. For example, we would take a dialogue, listen to it, mark the pauses, mark the stress, identify the intonation, repeat chunk by chunk, tone unit by tone unit, until I felt confident it was accurate enough, but also that it flowed naturally. And this sort of over and over was seriously over and over and over again for hours. It was a chore. It wasn't very fascinating to do. Not always enjoyable, but we all made significant progress, and that sense of achievement is enjoyable. I think there are also echoes of deliberate practice in the so-called and quite again unfashionable controlled practice exercises for remedial work, for spelling, for handwriting practice, where the alphabet of the students who are learning English is different from the English language, etc. The 5th aspect for me is the importance of taking risks and seeking feedback. Our fear and our self-consciousness about making mistakes can make us risk-averse. And I find it fascinating that we can be very, very understanding about our own students' errors. We tell them that they're learning steps, that they're welcome, etc., etc., and yet we don't always apply the same logic or even the same compassion when it comes to our own mistakes. And to be honest with you, I hate making mistakes, but they're so useful. Without taking those risks and without making those mistakes, I don't make progress because I don't get the feedback that I need. So probably, I try and find colleagues or friends that I find I trust and I feel comfortable with, and I ask them to let me know when I make mistakes. And I think that's very useful. And the 6th aspect is to thoroughly prepare and check. So when I'm planning lessons, I double check. And even though I think I know something very well, I double check the meanings and the uses and the functions of grammatical items. I plan the collocations, the register, the connotation of new lexes, pronunciation and word stress. Sometimes I found I was pretty sure I knew the meaning or the pronunciation of something, and by checking I realized I was wrong, and because I was wrong, and if I hadn't checked, I would have taught something wrong to my students. These are my favorite sources for checking. I'll leave them with you, and you can always read them later. And I want to close with one thought from one of my educational heroes, Carl Rogers. He was very interested in becoming real and genuine, and he says, can I be in some way which will be perceived by the other person being my students, my colleagues, etc., as trustworthy, dependable, or consistent in some deep sense? He says that both research and experience indicate that this is very important. And towards the end of his career, he has come to recognize that being trustworthy demands that I be dependently real. I have come to my stage in my career when I no longer say or hide who I am. I'm very comfortable in my own skin, and I say I'm Argentinian and I'm a speaker of English as an additional language. Thank you very much. That's the end of my talk. So I'm here if you have any questions for me.
Thank you very much, Silvana. We certainly do have questions, and there's been a lot of comment in the chat. People really really engaged and enthusiastic, and quite understandably cross about the situation for non-native speaker teachers. So, first question from David Achoro Colorado Ortiz, who says, if all these points are so evident about the quality and the skills of non-native speaker teachers, why do so many institutions still discriminate?
I think we haven't done enough work to raise the profile of the contributions that we have. And I think that as a profession, we're not even aware sometimes of how we can be, of our own prejudices, if you like, and our own discrimination. Yesterday I was in a conference, and there were some directors of studies, for example, talking about the recruitment of new teachers and the need to get to basically pre-filter non-native teachers through a phone call. And I thought everybody was blithely unaware of how prejudiced and discriminatory that practice was. And because we lived and breathe, we still breathe in a profession that defines us as non-native speakers, and that's okay. I think a lot of work still needs to be done. We need to talk about this. We need to raise people's awareness about this. We need to be more vocal about it.
Thanks. A question now that actually I'll be able to answer, because we had a question about whether Cambridge University Press would use non-native speakers to write any of our books. And yes, the answer to that is yes, we do. I mean, aside from obviously Herbert Puchter, we have a number of other people writing books for us, including Vicky Saumel from Argentina is writing some training resources on a secondary course we're working on at the moment. We've got Herbert's co-writer Gunther Gernros, and a lot of methodology titles as well, Peter Medgiez, and a number of Spanish speakers working on products for young learners in Spanish-speaking countries. So I'm very pleased to say that we do have quite a number of non-native speakers working on books for us. But to switch back to asking Silvana questions, which is what we're here for, really, a question now from Christine Sutro-Chandley, which is from actually the previous talk, but I saved it for this one. Christine says that she still has a bit of a complex about having a French accent while speaking English, despite having lived here in the UK for 30 years. How can she overcome that?
So I suppose what do you want to overcome, the complex or the accent? That's a question for me. For me, the question is, why do you have that complex? What is problematic about having a French accent? Maybe, for me, it was I like having sort of not a very, right now I could be speaking with my Argentinian accent, and I'm not. I prefer to have this accent. So it's either coming to terms with the fact that maybe you would like to have a less French accent and doing something about it, or understanding better what the source of that complex is and thinking around that.
Okay, thanks. We'll try to fit in another couple of questions. Two very similar ones here from Mohammed Shujat and Irina Herenzra. Apologies, Irina, for my pronunciation there. Why do students find native speaker teachers more motivating, and how do you earn their recognition as a non-native speaker teacher?
I think we're not, yes, it's got to do with the fact that it's the naturalness and the authenticity of it, I suppose. I remember working in organizations where we worked in pairs. So each student or each class had a native speaker and a non-native speaker. And consistently what students said was that they valued us both. They valued the sort of the natural authenticity, the fluency of the teacher whose first language is English, but equally they valued the pedagogical value of the teacher whose first language was the student's mother tongue, and that capacity and knowledge of grammar and to explain it clearly and to, access their own language to help them. So I think we should look at it in both ways. It's both. People like and appreciate both.
Okay, thanks. One final question now, though of course Silvana will be joining us again for the panel session straight after this. From Mohammed Hosni, how can a non-native speaker teacher be competent enough in using idioms and collocations? Do you have any sort of tips on that, please?
Yeah, well, so basically what I was saying before, noticing them first, notice where they start and where they finish, and remembering them. It's actually about, taking the time and the effort to memorize them, to be able to, and notice in which contexts they appear so that we use them appropriately. But there's nothing impossible about that. It's just a matter of having the right exposure and the right practice.
Thanks very much, Silvana. We're going to take a 5-minute break now, but we'll be back at 12:03 to start the panel session where we've got all 5 of our speakers back again, and they'll be chaired by Eric Baber. We'll just do a quick sound check with Eric now, in 1 minute's time. Okay, so thank you very much. Time for a very quick break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes.